Okay, so today we're going to be continuing our study of the mission of the Messiah. And this is, of course, a very important, critical part of understanding how God is working in history and the principles through which he has been working, how he continues to work. So we will do our part 2 here. In this part 2, we're going to be studying the mission of John the Baptist. So in part 1, we looked at what is the meaning of the word Messiah or Christ, and what the true mission of the Messiah is. Why does the Messiah come? Why does God send the Messiah? But in this lesson, we'll take a closer look at the critical role for which John the Baptist was uniquely prepared in relation to the Messiah. As previously discussed, the ultimate mission of the Messiah is to fulfill the original will of God, which is the same eternal, absolute, and unchanging will and purpose God had when he created mankind and the universe. So we always connect back to God's original purpose of creation. So let's take a quick review of that as we continue our study. So Genesis 1:28, very much in the beginning, it says, "Then God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So what were these 3 blessings? First, it was that as individuals, our mind and body would be united, centered on God, where we would experience God in our heart and through his word, through love and truth. And then we would grow and mature to become mature, true individuals, adults who could reflect the loving parental heart of God. Then the second blessing, to multiply. Then as husband and wife, a man and a woman would come together, form a family, a true family, which then through their descendants would have expanded to a society, nation, and world, all centered upon the God of love. And then the third blessing, to have dominion over creation. So these people would be living in the midst of the beautiful creation that God gave and would be able to take care of it and be creative with it and build things with it and explore with it, but all again centered on God's love. This is, in fact, the kingdom of heaven, which would have been created on earth and in the spiritual world. But the reality is, as we know, that Adam and Eve fell. They disobeyed God's direct commandment to them. So what were the results of the fall? First of all, instead of human beings being centered on God, we actually were obedient to Satan and became dominated by Satan. So every human being became a sinful and fallen person. Then fallen men married fallen women and created fallen families, and that expanded over generation and generation, over hundreds and thousands of years to create a fallen society, nation, and world. So everybody was, instead of coming from God's pure lineage, we became children of Satan, and we inherited his fallen lineage. And then thirdly, as Satan dominated fallen families and societies and nations, we also never had a true dominion of creation, and instead we created hell on earth. So this was the great tragedy of the fall, which brought about suffering to Adam and Eve and all their descendants, as well as to the heart of our Heavenly Father. So as a God of love, he could only think about how he could restore his children back to a relationship with him. Then what are the fundamental principles through which God works to make that happen, to make that restoration process happen? Originally, if man had not fallen, God would have no need to bring salvation to mankind by sending the Messiah. So again, it's hard, especially for Christians, to imagine there not being a Messiah, that we don't need to be saved. And that's how God originally planned it. But since we did fall, God had to go a different route to accomplish his will of establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth and in heaven. So rather than establishing his kingdom centered on Adam and Eve, God's will became the salvation of his children and the establishment of his kingdom centered on the Messiah, who comes as the second Adam. So again, it's very similar to what the original principle was, or purpose was, except God had to go a different route. And that route was, first of all, he had to prepare a chosen nation that would be ready to receive the Messiah. He would then send the Messiah. And man's responsibility is to do what then? To welcome and follow the Messiah when he does come. And if the people obey, they can receive blessing. If they disobey, they are cursed, and God's providence is prolonged once again. So in preparation for the coming of Christ, God guided Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants to establish a chosen nation, which is the nation of Israel, which could welcome Christ. As we studied in the last presentation, God prepared the Jewish people by sending prophets who foretold how God would work at the time of the coming of the Messiah. So God wanted to be sure they would be ready to receive the Messiah when he sent him. So how are the people of Israel supposed to know when the Messiah would come? In Malachi 4:5, God says, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. This means that the prophet Elijah, who lived around 500 years before Malachi, would return just before the coming of Christ as a sign of Christ's imminent appearance. So what happened to Elijah at the end of his earthly life? 2 Kings 2:11 tells us, a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So Elijah was last seen heading up to heaven in a fiery chariot. Then how did Elijah return to prepare the way for the Lord? 400 years after Malachi, Jesus finally came to Israel, but where was Elijah? The book of Luke tells us that Zacharias, John the Baptist's father and a respected priest, received a revelation about his son John before he was born. Luke 1:17 says, and he will go in the spirit and power of Elijah to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So it was none other than John the Baptist who came in Elijah's role to prepare the people to follow Christ, fulfilling the prophecy of Malachi. So John the Baptist was, in effect, Elijah. So what did it mean that John the Baptist was the return of Elijah? Wasn't John a different person from Elijah? Although the prophecy of Malachi specifically said, I will send the prophet Elijah before the coming of Christ, this second coming of Elijah did not take place in a literal physical sense. According to the Old Testament, Elijah was taken up in the clouds in a fiery chariot. So although it would logically make sense that Elijah should return by coming down from the clouds of heaven, that is not how the prophecy was fulfilled. God did not send the same physical person of Elijah. Instead, he sent a different person who was born on earth, who was given a similar mission as Elijah, preparing the people of Israel to meet the Lord. So the prophecy of Malachi was fulfilled through the earthly birth of John the Baptist. So there's some very important principles and lessons here in this part. So what does the Bible tell us about John the Baptist? He was the greatest religious leader at the time of Christ. The people were waiting expectantly and were all wondering in their hearts that John might possibly be the Messiah. So he was so great, they even thought he might be Christ. King Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. Mark 6:20. So John was such a powerful and righteous man. People looked up to him with great respect and awe, believing he was sent to them by God for a special mission. So it sounds like God had prepared things well, and John was ready to accomplish his mission that God had sent him for. Since he was sent by God to prepare the people for the coming of the long-awaited Messiah, what would be the most important part of that mission? John's mission was to bear witness to Jesus as the Messiah. In John 1:6-7, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came for testimony, to bear witness to the light, that all might believe through him. So he came to testify, right, to Jesus, testify to the light. As explained in the book of John, God sent John the Baptist to witness to the people about Jesus. so that everyone would believe that Jesus was the Christ. Doesn't that make sense? That would be John's primary mission. So let's take a closer look at what God had planned for John the Baptist, for Jesus, and for Israel. Again, God was working and had prepared everything for this moment. Since John himself was waiting for the coming of the Messiah, you might naturally think that when he found out who the Messiah was, he would become his first disciple and his greatest disciple, right? He was waiting his whole life for the Messiah. So you think, okay, there's Jesus, he's the Messiah, I'm going to follow him. What greater honor and blessing could there have been compared to being able to directly attend Christ at his coming? If John fully united with Jesus from the position of Jesus' disciple, all the people of Israel who respected John would have followed John's example and themselves become followers of Jesus, their Messiah, their Savior and King. God's plan was for Israel then to spread Jesus' message and the establishment of the kingdom through the Roman Empire to the entire world. God had prepared everything for the fulfillment of his will at the time of Jesus. So sounds like a pretty good plan, doesn't it? So what kind of life did John have, and how was he viewed by his contemporaries? First of all, he was born to a prominent family. His father was the high priest, Zechariah. John had quite a miraculous birth. So his parents were quite old when they conceived John. And when an angel revealed to Zechariah that they would have a son, Zechariah was temporarily struck dumb. So even before he was born, people expected him to be a great man of God. Number 3, he was leading an exemplary life. So John was not concerned about physical wealth or comfortable life. He often fasted, or he ate locusts and wild honey. People thought that John might even be the Messiah, as I mentioned earlier. They thought he might be the Christ. And he was respected by priests and Levites, even though in some ways they feared him as well because he was so righteous and strong. So this is the view that the people of that time had of John the Baptist. Let's contrast that with how Jesus was viewed by the people of Israel at that time. First of all, Jesus came from a poor, lonely family. He was born in Nazareth. He was considered illegitimate. When Mary became pregnant, she was engaged to Joseph, but Joseph was not the father. People naturally wondered who the father was. So he was considered an illegitimate child. He made extraordinary claims about himself and about John the Baptist. He even compared himself to God. When you see me, you see the Father. He was called blasphemous, again, making himself out to be like God. And he had very questionable associates. So Jesus' disciples were not necessarily highly educated or respected people of the society. He had fishermen and tax collectors. They were common laborers and people who even liked to drink. So based on all these things, Jesus did not have nearly the level of respect that John the Baptist did. And in fact, Jesus was scorned and looked down upon, especially by the religious people of this time. Then what did Jesus have to say about John the Baptist? Jesus proclaimed John to be the returned Elijah. So as we already established, this is the role that John had. And Jesus confirmed that. He said in Matthew 11:14, and if you are willing to accept it, he, John, is the Elijah who was to come. And in Matthew 17:14, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. And the disciples understood he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So it was clear from Jesus' own words that John the Baptist himself was the fulfillment of the prophecy of the second coming of Elijah. So before Jesus came, John was in the highest position as God's servant and a prophet of the people of Israel, right? He was so well respected and looked up to. And in a sense, this is similar to the position that the archangel Lucifer was in before Adam was created. God had made all the things of creation, and then he made these beautiful angels, and Lucifer, the angel of light, was one of the archangels. So he was in a very high position, closest to God compared to anything else, again, before Adam. So John the Baptist came in the position of Elijah, not to be glorified himself, but to prepare the way for the Lord who would come as the new Adam. So just like the archangel Lucifer, he had a mission to prepare the world for Adam to come. John, in the same way, had a mission to prepare the way for Jesus as the new Adam. So how did things change after Jesus appeared? Jesus came as the second Adam with the mission to fulfill the three blessings and to restore fallen man back to God's lineage. Once Jesus appeared before John, John's responsibility was to humble himself to Jesus, testifying to him and living in attendance to him, fulfilling the mission of the returned Elijah. As a person of fallen lineage, John naturally experienced the fallen natures inherited from Satan in relationship to Jesus. So we always have to remember it, even these great people, these prophets and saints, you can even think about the kings of the Old Testament, Saul, David, Solomon, and think about all the sins that they committed. So even the greatest people, even John the Baptist, had to deal with his fallen natures. So his responsibility was to overcome those fallen natures, to serve Christ as the new Adam. So let's see what happened next. John initially testified to Jesus as the Messiah. Then John gave this testimony: I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. And I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down to remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is God's chosen one. So far, so good, right? God clearly revealed to John who Jesus was. He was the chosen one, the Son of God, whom the people of Israel had been waiting for. So based on this, we can conclude that there should not have been even a speck of doubt in John's mind about the position of Jesus. And although John already had a revelation from God about Jesus, he later questioned whether Jesus was the one. Matthew 11, 2-3. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Now, this sounds like an odd question, doesn't it? After the strong testimony we had just read. John knew in his heart that he should have humbled himself and worked directly under Jesus. But instead, he sends this message with his disciples. Oh, are you really the Messiah? Are you the one that I should have been following? So this question that he sent to his disciples, or sent his disciples to ask Jesus, was not so much a question of truth, trying to find out what the truth was, as it was an expression of his own guilty conscience. He already knew the answer to this question because he had received revelation directly from God that Jesus was the Messiah. So what did John's disciples think about their leader's efforts and what Jesus was doing? Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside and baptized. John was also baptizing. John's disciples came to John and said to him, Rabbi, the one you testified about, everyone is going to him. To this, John replied, he must become greater, I must become less. So it makes sense that John's disciples wondered why John himself was not working with the very person John had testified about, right? John had testified that Jesus was the Messiah, so naturally the disciples are wondering, well, why aren't you over there with Jesus? And certainly if John had led his followers to become disciples of Jesus, they would have gladly and naturally followed along. Many Christians have actually praised John's reply as an expression of humility, recognizing that Jesus was meant to take a higher position than himself. If John had supported and worked with Jesus directly, would he have become less? So again, John says, he must become greater and I must become less. But if John followed Jesus, would John have become less? Absolutely not. He would have become known for eternity as Jesus' greatest follower, the one who helped Jesus establish God's kingdom in Israel, rather than merely a voice crying in the wilderness. If John was truly humble, he would have willingly accepted a supportive role in relationship to Jesus. So this was the key challenge or test, in a way, for John the Baptist, who was always the number one guy, to humble himself and to serve Jesus. Furthermore, John the Baptist categorically denied his mission as the returning Elijah. John 1:19-21 says, "Now this is the testimony of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?' he confessed, and he did not deny, but confessed, 'I am not the Christ.' And they asked him, 'What then? Are you Elijah?' He said, 'I am not.' 'Are you the prophet?' And he said, 'No.'" Even this is after all those revelations that had come before and after what Jesus had said. So if John had become a direct disciple of Jesus, Jesus could have spoken directly to John and cleared up any misunderstandings John may have had. John the Baptist's denial of his mission not only contradicted the revelation that his father received prior to his birth, but also the testimony of Jesus about John's mission. Again, Jesus made it very clear that John was Elijah, and then John is denying his mission. Since the people had a great respect for John and were already wary of the man called Jesus, who were they more likely to believe? So the people were put in the difficult position to either believe John or to believe Jesus. The fact is that John's failure to fulfill his mission made it much more difficult for Jesus to be believed and accepted as the Messiah the people of Israel were waiting for. In Matthew 11:4-6, we read, "Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me.'" So John should have not needed Jesus to send someone to tell him what he was doing, right? But if John had been there with Jesus, he would have been participating in all that. Oh, excuse me. I think I lost the, hold on here. Okay. Okay, I think we're back. All right. So, let's see. Sorry, I lost my place here. Okay, so John should not have needed, to hear this message from Jesus. If he had been with John, if John had been with Jesus from the beginning, John would have seen everything that Jesus was doing because he would have participated in it. So John should have been with Jesus from the moment the Holy Spirit descended like a dove on Jesus and testified to him as the Son of God, right? Can you imagine once John had that experience, if he then had followed Jesus, how things would have been totally different? So in Matthew 11:11, Jesus responded to John's expression of doubt. "Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." So this seems like an odd thing at first, especially if people thought, oh, John was such a great prophet and one of the greatest people in the Bible. But Jesus' words indicate that although John was born to be the greatest person on earth, other than Christ himself, John's failure put him in a position below the least in the kingdom. So if the least person in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John, where does that put John? John was now outside the realm of God's blessing because of his failure. So let's take a closer look at how John the Baptist allowed his fallen natures to influence his actions and eventually fail his mission. So again, we studied these fallen natures when we studied the fall of man, and these are things that on one level or another, all of us can relate to. So although John was a great prophet among the people of Israel, it cannot be denied that he was still a fallen person, right? Didn't John have original sin? Didn't he need to be saved? Didn't he have all these fallen natures? So John's responsibility was to humble himself and unite with Jesus, overcoming his fallen nature and thereby restoring the failure of the archangel. Satan's desire was that John do what? Did Satan want John the Baptist to help and work with Jesus. It's actually the opposite, right? Satan's desire was that John not unite with Jesus, because had he united completely with Jesus, God's kingdom could have been fulfilled at that time. So as soon as God's kingdom is fulfilled and Jesus takes his position as the Lord of the kingdom, then what happens to Satan, right? Satan loses his dominion. So let's look at these fallen natures. One, again, the failure to see from God's viewpoint. John did not see Jesus from God's viewpoint, right? He should have seen him as the Christ who was, the one that he should be following and be obedient to. But instead, John left his position. Instead of following him, he just went his own way. He reversed dominion. So think about all his disciples. So John kept leading his own disciples and kept speaking to his own disciples rather than bringing them over to Jesus. And then multiplication of evil. Through John's lack of belief and failure to act in support of Jesus, many others were influenced in a negative way. So think about all the people who could not follow Jesus because John himself never actually followed Jesus. So then what is the impact of John's failure? Because of John's failure to unite with Jesus, the Jewish leaders were not able to recognize him as the Messiah. Without their leaders' acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah they were looking for, it made it much more difficult for the people of Israel to recognize and follow him. So can you begin to get a sense how important was the mission and the position of John the Baptist? So a fundamental principle, again, we're studying biblical principles right through this series. A fundamental principle we see throughout the Bible is that God never interferes with man's free will and the human 5% portion of responsibility, regardless of the consequences of failure. Right? So this was true from the time God gave his commandment to Adam and Eve and remains true even now. So when God gave Adam and Eve free will and the responsibility to obey the commandment, and when he saw that they were about to eat the fruit, did he just change his principle and interfere and say, oh, no, I'm not going to let you make that mistake because things are going to be messed up for thousands of years? Did he do that? Regardless of how horrible the consequences are, God has to allow human beings to fulfill their responsibility. So God's primary plan to establish his kingdom centered on Jesus depended on what? John the Baptist fulfilling his portion of responsibility. And the tragic historical fact is that John the Baptist, who had thousands of followers at the time Jesus began his public ministry, never followed Jesus himself. Due to the failure of John the Baptist, Jesus had to go a different and much, much more difficult path to accomplish God's will. And this is where we'll pick up in the next presentation. We'll examine the path that God had Jesus walk in order to bring God's will closer to fulfillment. Thank you very much. This is the presentation for today.